Boy, life certainly has changed since we were growing up, hasn't it? And I can remember when I was a kid. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. I still remember being able to get on my bike, and it was 2 or 3 miles. We'd have to ride to the city pool. Ours was called Hill Valley Pool, and we'd spend all afternoon or evening there swimming at the pool, hanging out with our friends. And if we wanted to, we could ride another mile onto the Marathon gas station, where we would buy baseball cards, we'd buy ice cream, and those red, white, and blue bomb pops. Do you remember those? And we would sit under a tree, and we'd try to eat all the ice cream before it melted, and then we'd trade the cards back and forth. By the way, I had each of these cards. I had a Hank Aaron card, I had Pete Rose, I had the Reggie Jackson card. And we would just spend all day just running around the countryside, having fun. We wouldn't see our parents for sometimes any time during the day. And we knew we had to be home when the street lights came on or the lightning bug started lighting up, and it was time to come home. It was just such a cool time of growing up. I mean, life has changed a lot, hasn't it? I mean, parents, a lot of times, we're afraid to let our kids out of our sight, let alone out of the yard anymore, and for good reason. It's a scary world that we live in. There was one time I was sitting on the back of a pickup truck. The tailgate was down, and I was sitting on the back of the pickup truck with 2 other players of our Little League team. We were on the B&P Trophies team. We had bright yellow jerseys. And we're sitting on the pickup truck. One of the dads was driving the truck down, it was State Route 430, and we're heading to the baseball game. My feet were dangling over the end of the tailgate, and I had steel cleats on. And I would just drag the cleats on the road, and sparks were flying off of those cleats, and there was a car behind me, and it was just so cool, and nobody thought anything that this was terrible, that we didn't worry about, hey, somebody's going to fall off the truck. We didn't worry about seat belts. We didn't worry about explosions. We didn't worry about what was going to happen when I go sliding into second base with those now sharpened steel cleats. We didn't think about those things like that, because life was simple and life was good, and it was just a great time to live back then. And maybe you think about when you were growing up. Do you remember growing up and maybe you watched Full House? Is that one of the shows that you watched growing up? Or maybe you go back a little earlier. Do you remember Little House on the Prairie days? Maybe you go back a little further, before God created color, and there was Leave It to Beaver. Do you remember those shows? I mean, they were all good shows. They had good family values, and they taught us something. And man, we look at what we watch today, we're like, what? How have we gotten here? Life has just changed so much. There was so many wonderful blessings about growing up when I grew up, but I have to admit, not everything was good. Even in the 70s and the 80s, or whatever your generation was. I look back on mine, and I recognize that in my growing up years, promiscuous sex was definitely a thing. There was drugs that were prolific. LSD was the drug of choice then, and then actually in the 70s, 80s, marijuana was a real problem in high school, and also it was trickling down into the middle school grades as well. There were assassinations. Presidents were shot. World leaders were attacked. There was an unpopular war. Men wore leisure suits, okay? In public. Some of you used to wear some of those. You might still have those. I dare you to break one of those out on a Sunday morning. I just dare you to do it. But life was rough. So, do some of you remember back in 1970 that there was about 50,000 people who descended upon the little town of Wadena, Iowa? How many of you remember that? Yeah, there was a big rock festival that happened up there. I mean, even the governor of Iowa showed up because they were concerned, what is going on up here in Wadena? There were bands like Little Richard, the Guess Who was there. There were the Everly Brothers were there. They were rocking the stage, and can we just put it this way? There was a whole lot of shaking going on in the crowd, okay? And it was just a crazy time, and there were a lot of good things about growing up back then, but there was a lot of difficult things going on in the world. It was not an easy time to try to live a holy life. Quite frankly, there has never been a time where it's been easy to live for God. This world is not a friend of grace, is it? This is a world that is bent, that is twisted, that is broken. And from what I read throughout history, that's kind of the way it's been. You look back in the first century, that was a horrible time for those who are trying to live for God and to follow Jesus. And it's still dangerous today to live a holy life. You look at places like Iran, or maybe Saudi Arabia, China, other places in the world. It is a dangerous place to live if you have faith in Jesus. For the rest of our month here of May, and then even into June a little bit, I want to reintroduce you to an old friend. Someone that you may know about. He wrote a book in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, and it's such a wonderful book. We need to get reacquainted with him. He's one of my heroes. In fact, our youngest son, his name is Joshua Daniel, because those are two of my favorite Bible characters, and so we see that name right there. Now, some of you, you learned about Daniel in Sunday school. I mean, this book of Daniel, it is a Sunday school teacher's delight. I mean, there is so much that you just can't wait to teach. And, there's a fiery furnace. There are people being thrown into the fire. There's a lion's den. There's handwriting on the wall. It's crazy. I mean, I can imagine just when Daniel was coming up in the curriculum and Louise was about to teach about Daniel. I mean, the flannel graph would be on fire for 6 weeks straight. That's just how it was going to be. And every kid, you had to be there, and you had your little piece that you're going to be able to put up on the flannel graph board when it was time to put your little tree or whatever it was that you get to put on the storyboard for that week. And other people, maybe you look at the book of Daniel and you remember that there's a lot of prophecy about the second coming of Christ. And when you think of Daniel, you think of charts and graphs, and there's arrows and references, and it's just so much that's going on there in Daniel. And you know what? That's all there. There's so much in this incredible book. This book, though, while there's a lot of adventure, there's plenty of prophecy. This book, really, this story of Daniel is really a message of how we can thrive for God in an evil environment. Because that's exactly what Daniel was doing. As time marches on, it seems like, as I look at the world around me, it seems as if the moral fabric is tearing faster than ever in our culture. Have you noticed that? The things that we used to consider shameful, we now celebrate those very same lifestyles. And we accept them as normal now in our culture. What we used to call unthinkable, unimaginable, it is now commonplace. And for those who want to live for God and to represent Christ, and it makes it difficult for us to even try to speak into a culture that is racing away on its way to Armageddon. In just a few decades, we have moved from being people of faith who are respected for our faith to then become marginalized or indifferent. And then we're moving closer and closer to just outright hostility to anyone who claims the name of Jesus. And if we want to say something that's contrary to the new normal, then we run the risk of committing the unpardonable sin of intolerance. And we can even talk about all of what that means. But we sure do need a friend in times like these, don't we? And that's exactly what Daniel is. He's an incredible model and a mentor for us of not how do we just survive in an evil environment, but how can we thrive and honor God in an environment that seems to be spinning so quickly into the darkness. So Daniel found a way somehow in a culture that was more wicked than anything that we can even imagine today. He found a way to live in such a measured way that he was honored, he was respected, he was revered by kings, by peasants, and by 3 different kingdoms They came and they recognized the value and the greatness, not only of Daniel, but the God Daniel served. And so in these few weeks that we are going to be sharing together, here in May, I think it's going to trickle over into June as well, depending on who's preaching. It'll be June, trust me. We'll find out, how did Daniel do this? And how can we live for God in a godless culture? So let's just talk about how this all happened. What really happened? Well, Daniel lived 600 years before Jesus was born. And as he was born there in the city of Jerusalem, as he grew up, he saw, as a young teenage boy, he saw there was a large army that was surrounding the capital city of Jerusalem. It was the Babylonian army. They were the biggest and the baddest bully in the world. They were the superpower, and they were just taking out one kingdom after the next kingdom. They were just marching along and putting victory marks into their belt over and over again, and they came and they surrounded the kingdom of Israel, God's people. And as we look at that, we recognize that God had promised that if His people, if they would honor Him, He would honor them, He would bless them and give them incredible success. But if the people would dishonor God, He warned them that punishment was coming. And of course, that's exactly what happened. The people dishonored God in the Old Testament, and God eventually brought the Babylonian army, and He took the nation of Israel, He took them into captivity. And as we look at the life of Daniel, we realize that this is how he was living. The first few verses of Daniel help to explain what happened. And so this is what Daniel says to us as he opens his book. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Now this book of Daniel, this is his account of what happened. He was an old man. He's looking back on all that God brought him through this world and how God worked throughout his life. And really the opening verses here are so important because you see there it says, and the Lord delivered. And that is so powerful to recognize that even when it seems like everything's falling apart, look who is the one who is in charge of it all. The Lord is the one who's delivering. The Lord is the one who's sending His people into different places in order to accomplish what He wants to do at a particular time. If you're wondering, why does God have me where I am right now? It is because the Lord has delivered you to that place for that time. We may not understand it. We may not like it. We may wish we could get out of it. But guess what? The Lord is the one who delivered it. And boy, if there is one thing I want you to get, if there's one statement out of everything that we want to share in this sermon series, it is this: God is in control of those who are in control. Isn't that true? God is in control of those in control. We may not like the people who are in control. We may not think any of their decisions are making are any good whatsoever. But never forget this simple and profound truth. God is in control of those in control. Now, this was a horrible time for God's people. It wasn't the first time God's people were going through bad times. And it certainly wasn't the last. But this was a horrible time. And guess what? They brought it on themselves. They really did. And Daniel, this young man, he was caught in the backwash of other people's sin. Sometimes that still happens today, doesn't it? We're trying to live for God. We're trying to honor Him the very best we can. We want to make a difference in the world, but it seems as if because of the decisions of other people who are not honoring God, who did not even recognize the name of Jesus, but yet, because of their decisions, that seems to roll back on those who are trying to live for God. Boy, that happens even today. Simply because you're living for God, that doesn't mean that you are insulated from the hand of God's judgment. The Lord, even today, He sends the rain on the just and on the unjust. At times, innocent people suffer in a world that is broken. We want to talk about Babylon for a moment, and just how bad was Babylon? Well, Babylon was the personification of evil. That's how bad it was. If you would look back into the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, just before Christ returns in triumph in his second coming, a mighty angel from heaven comes down and will stand upon the earth and will proclaim this: fallen is Babylon the Great. Well, that's kind of a strange thing to say, because according to the Bible, the Babylonian Empire has already fallen. And God promised that that empire will not rise again. But yet, at the end of time, when Christ is coming and to bring ultimate judgment, we read the angel of heaven is saying, fallen is Babylon the Great. I mean, they don't say, fallen is Al-Qaeda. Fallen is Nazi Germany. Fallen is Russia. Fallen is China. No, what they're pointing to is, if we can identify the greatest evil of all of human history, hey, Babylon takes that prize. The great evil of Babylon is fallen. And God, though, He used this evil empire as His tool of punishment upon the people of God. And we wonder about that. Why does God work like that in such a way? Because we would think that, okay, God should be punishing the evil people, right? Not the people trying to live for Him. He should be punishing those who are not living for Him. Well, He'll get to them, trust me. But God is a good Father. When there are issues going on in the family, guess what? God starts the punishment with His own family. And as we look, that's exactly what God was doing with Babylon. God used Babylon as His instrument of punishment and correction for His people. As we look at what the king of Babylon did, King Nebuchadnezzar, he sent his troops into the very holy temple of God and took many of the wonderful articles of God out of the temple we read about in the Old Testament. And he takes those articles back to Babylon and he puts them into his own satanic temple. This is his way of mocking God Himself and saying, I've defeated this God of Israel, the great God that they thought it was so amazing. I have defeated Him too, and I'm putting Him up on my trophy wall. As we look at the evils of Babylon, we see Nebuchadnezzar just a little later on. He built a statue 90 feet tall, and he commanded everybody in his kingdom to bow down to this statue of me. And if you don't, of course you have a choice. If you don't want to bow down, you will die. It's either bow down or die. The state-sponsored religion in Babylon was purely satanic. The core curriculum in the state-sponsored schools was astrology and the occult. And then, as the army of Babylon, they came back from Jerusalem, they bring some of the best and the brightest people for new recruits for the king to go into the king's service. One of those people was a man named Daniel. Daniel was subjected to go to the schools that the king commanded them to go to, study the subjects he was supposed to study. And guess what? Get this. Daniel not only studied the occult, not only did he study astronomy and astrology, Daniel graduated top of his class. Which is a really interesting point there. So he has this dilemma here. In verse 6, we see this coming up. We are told that among those who were chosen from some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Daniel and his friends, they were kidnapped and they were taken away from their families. They were taken away from their homeland. They were taken away from the godly influences that they had in Jerusalem, and they're taken from a far-off place into an evil, evil place. And I bet when they got there, they felt like, I have not one friend at all. I've got nobody to support me. Here's a little tidbit that I doubt that ever ended up on Louise's flannel graph. Daniel and his friends, they were castrated. Yeah, that didn't show up in Louise's class, did it? But you think about it. Nowhere in the book of Daniel or anywhere in the Bible do we read about Daniel or any of his friends. We read about their spouses or their children. And for people of Israel, your family legacy, this was everything. Because if I don't have a family legacy that want to go back to the promised land, then our land that was part of our family, that gets absorbed to somebody else's family. We lose our property in the Holy Lands. And I lose my name. And I slip through the cracks of history. And really, just if you think about it from the king's point of view, he is bringing these handsome and wonderful and wise young men into his court. He also brings the beautiful women into his harem. The last thing he wants is to have these young kids taking some of his girls. Their names were changed to honor Satan. The word Daniel means God is my judge. The new name that he got, Belteshazzar, means prince of Satan. They were forced, of course, to study the occult and then go into the service of an evil king. Here's Daniel. He was this young man. He was handsome. He was bright. He had so much ability. He was what we would call the cream of the crop, I guess. And now he is the kind of kid, if you have a daughter, he's the guy that you want your kid to marry. And now he's taken away from everything. His dream for his life is turning into a nightmare. Like that happens. I don't know about you, but when I look at all that Daniel had to go through, all the struggles, all the hard things that he faced in his life, I compare them to my struggles, my difficulties, which are real. I don't have anything to complain about. God has been very, very good to me. All of my excuses about the struggles I have, boy, they pale in comparison to Daniel. And somehow, though, Daniel was able not just to kind of weather the storm here and get back to his homeland. Somehow he did more than survive, didn't he? Somehow Daniel was able to thrive in this evil environment. I want to share with you, I think, 3 secrets that Daniel had that really helped him in order to be a bright light into a dark place. And this can help every one of us. Maybe the place that you're living now, maybe or your workplace or your school place that you go to school or wherever it might be. Maybe you think, man, there's a lot of darkness here. There's a lot of brokenness, a lot of sin here. How can I honor God in this dark place? Well, I think Daniel gives us at least 3 really good ways that we can do this. And we're going to be expanding upon each of these. But the first secret that Daniel had, he had hope. He had real hope. I mean, he knew that even when it seemed like evil was having his day, God is still in control of those in control. Even when it seems like everything has fallen apart, guess what? We have hope in the God who takes all the broken and jagged pieces of life and He is able to put them in their proper place. That's the God we have. We serve a God who's able to do that, who's able to work, and He causes all things to work together for good. All the things that I like about life and all the things I don't like about life. We serve a God who takes all things and He puts them together for good. He uses everything. God doesn't waste a thing. Michael used to tell me, God can make a pretty picture out of a broken crayon. And that's exactly what God can do. He can take the brokenness of our lives now, the darkness of our lives, and He can create something beautiful. So Daniel had this hope. And now hope is not just wishful thinking. No, it's not that. Hope is not just, a positive attitude. I think, okay, maybe sometimes things are going to get better. No, as we have real hope in God, what we're saying is, I have a confident expectation that God is in control. See, believe it or not, as we look at the news today, we look at how bad the world is. It seems like everything's falling apart. God is not surprised. God is not frustrated. God's plan is not being somehow thrown off His schedule. No, everything is working according to His great plan. And that's why we can have hope in that. And we see it was that the Lord delivered just the right people to the right place there in Babylon. Think about that. Or I think of people like Zach Schultz, who is serving in Washington, D.C. When I pray for Zach Schultz, I pray for him as if I'm praying for a Daniel, that he could be a bright light in a dark place. And we don't have to go to Washington to do that. We can be a bright light in this dark place, right where we are. God sent Daniel to a dark place to shine the light of the Lord. Hope is not just, oh man, I think it's going to get better. No, it's a confident expectation that God is working all things together for good to those who love Him. Hope is not based on my present circumstances. Instead, it's based upon the one who is over all, who is working in all and through all, and the one who is building His kingdom that has no end. It's that what we proclaim in that great hymn, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. That's where I find my hope. And man, if you don't have hope, suddenly you are just in this quagmire of despair, aren't you? You just can't move forward. And so no wonder the enemy targets that hope that you have in Jesus. He'll hold up all these evil things, say, oh, well, look at that. You trust God, but then look what's happening over here. Yeah, you said that God was good, but then why is He allowing that to happen? The enemy targets your hope because he knows that is one of the spiritual strongholds that we have. If we lose our hope, we lose our faith, we lose our trust, we lose everything. The thing about it, though, if you have hope in Jesus, guess what? That hope is going to be tested. It will. As hard as it is to believe, sometimes the short-term success of the wicked is God's will for the moment. That is so hard for us to believe, isn't it? We don't see it. We don't understand how that can happen. But that's exactly what happened here. God sent Babylon to punish His people, even take some of them away. And Israel ceased to exist. Then 70 years later, in part because of the faithfulness of people like Daniel, a new administration came. And they allowed God's people to return and to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple of God, to rebuild the nation of Jerusalem. And guess what? What looked like there was no way that God's plan was going to continue, guess what? The plan of God to bring the Savior into the world was right on schedule. And ultimately, God used this plan, even working through Daniel and through Babylon and all that Daniel went through, God used this to bring Christ into the world. Sometimes we don't understand it, how God uses evil. But guess what? God is in control of those who are in control. And He brings about His plan right on time, right on schedule. When we really have hope, that helps us to fight off things like panic and worry and anxiety and fear. Panic and worry, fear, anxiety, that is not coming from God. That's coming from the camp of the enemy. And if you are struggling with that right now, if you feel like you're overcome with anxiety, you're overcome with worry, and there's panic in your life, and you don't think everything's going to get better, man, you just need to draw close to Jesus. Stay close to Him, because that is where your strength is going to come from. The enemy wants to separate you from God, because he knows that's where we have our strength. But boy, as we look at this thing called hope, that helps us to stave off those attacks of the enemy. Another secret, though, that Daniel had, that he models for us, and boy, we sure need that. He had this thing called humility. That's such a beautiful God-given gift. We're not born with humility. We're born with pride. We're born with a lot of selfishness inside of us. Here's what God says about the proud. God resists the proud. He gives grace to the humble. Now, if Daniel walked into Babylon and full of pride, thinking, I am so much better than all these wicked pagans around here, that man would not have lasted a day, would he? But instead, he came in with humility, and God was able to use him as a positive influence upon the very people who were trying to deconvert him, to deconstruct his faith, to tear apart any semblance of godliness in his life. He humbled himself to God and to God's plan, to God's timing. One of the first tests that he had, it was kind of an odd thing, but the king, of course, he has all these new recruits, in basic training. You got to feed these people. And so the king sent food that was sacrificed to on the satanic altars. He sends that food to his new recruits. They've got the satanic food. They got the wine there. This is what you're going to eat. I think, well, it's just food. Well, remember, back in the Old Testament, there was a special diet that God-fearing people would follow. Well, none of this food fit the kosher menu of those who are honoring God. And so here comes the food truck pulling up and say, okay, this is what you guys are going to eat. So Daniel, he's just a teenager. How is he going to deal with this? And in chapter 1, verse 8, we read, this is how Daniel dealt with this. It says in verse 8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Oh, isn't that interesting? The Lord delivered Daniel to this evil place, and God is working behind the scenes in the hearts of officials in order for this one particular one to show favor and compassion to, of all people, Daniel. Drop down to verse 11. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. And treat your servants in accordance to what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. What a gracious and a humble way to work in a very sticky situation. This could have went really bad for Daniel. But God gave him a victory here. Yeah, maybe it was a small victory, but it was a victory anyway. And he could see that even in this evil place, God's still working. How is it that this official is somehow showing favor to me? He has compassion on me. And even agrees to this 10-day plan. Now, some of you follow the Daniel plan diet, and that's a great plan. I follow the Peter plan, which I was just reading about in the book of Acts, where the Lord lowers down the sheet, and there's food of every kind of animal, and there's meat and all this stuff. Arise, kill, and eat. That's the food plan that I follow. But you follow yours. I'll follow whatever one I want to follow. By the way, that wasn't in my notes. That just came to me as I was preaching here. But Daniel shows us humility. He teaches us, you know what? Every person deserves respect, even your enemies. Even those that are against you, those who they're going out of their way to make your life difficult, they deserve your respect. They may not vote like you. They may not believe like you. They may not live like you. They may not even like you. But guess what? They deserve your respect. Because even those individuals who are against us, they are deeply loved by God. And if God loves them, He calls us to love them too. They are your neighbors, that you are called to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Is that easy? No, it's not easy. No, it's not natural. Frankly, it's supernatural. That's why we need to be remaining close to Christ and connected with Him so that His love can flow through us to those that are easy to love and those who are hard to love. You know, a third secret that Daniel, he lived by, and that was that Daniel had wisdom. Wisdom, I believe, is the ability to see life from God's point of view. You know, instead of looking through our lives through a very small keyhole and thinking, oh God, why are you allowing this to happen right now? Wisdom is the ability to be able to step back a little bit and believe that God is using everything, that God wastes nothing. The Lord puts all the beautiful colors of my life and the dark colors of the fabric of my life, He weaves them all together for good. Wisdom is what helps us understand there's a big difference between what we like and what God permits. There are things we don't like, but for whatever reason, God's permitting that for a time. You know, evil may be having its way right now, but guess what? God will ultimately have His way. He promises He will build His church. His kingdom will come. His will shall be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that is what's happening now. We can live with wisdom. We can live with humility. We can live with hope because there is one who is watching over us, who is working things far greater than what we can understand. There's a beautiful promise in Scripture that says that our God is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all that we could ever ask or think or imagine, according to the power that's already at work in you. You all right with that? That gives us great hope, doesn't it? We should be humbled at that. And that gives us wisdom, some perspective to be able to see that God is still working, even in an evil environment. There was a big dog on my paper route that I absolutely was terrified. Her name was Debbie. Sorry. I didn't name her. Okay. She was this German Shepherd with a very bad attitude. Debbie stayed in the garage. There was a 2-car garage, a big 16-foot wide garage door, and I was supposed to deliver the paper, walk into the garage, take the paper, set it on the step right by the door, and then be able to walk out, go to the next house. Well, that's where Debbie liked to sit. For some reason, I don't know, was she paper trained? I don't know, but they wanted the newspaper right there. And I was petrified. Every time I had to come to that house, I would pray. Maybe this is God taught me how to pray. Pray that somehow Debbie would be in the backyard when I happened to time my route so I could drop off that paper. I could slip in, set the paper down real quiet, and go back out, and she would never see me. Sometimes that's exactly what happened. There was one time in particular, though, I remember that I was coming up to the house and walking up, and I saw Debbie out in the backyard. I said, "Oh, good!" And so I was sneaking in that garage so quiet, and I set the newspaper down, and somehow I turned around, and I don't know if it hit a trash can or what happened. I made a little too much noise, and by the time I turned around, here comes Debbie. Her teeth are bared, and she is barking, and she is about to, take the very last bit of life I have out of me. My life was flashing before my eyes, and it's kind of boring, actually, but, it is happening. And it was in that moment in time that I learned something very important. This dog that terrified me, this dog that came with these big teeth and bad attitude and just wanted to rip through me, this dog was attached to a really big chain. And I realized that, if I worked this the right way, that dog could only come so far. And if I would just focus on the task at hand and stay on the right path, I could come in. I could do what I was supposed to do in that moment, and I could walk free. That changed everything. Listen, we live in an evil world, and there is a wicked prince of this world who wants to rip us apart. He's doing his very best to tear apart faith, to tear apart morality and godliness in this world. But God has provided a pathway for us, not just to survive, but that we can thrive in this world that He's placed us in. We're not minimizing the evil of this world. What we're trying to recognize is that God is at work, and He has appointed us to a particular place in a particular time, and He has all the grace we need if we focus on the task He wants us to do today. He's provided a pathway for us to navigate through some very difficult days, to accomplish what He wants us to do, where He wants us to do it, and He will get all the glory. So where do we get hope? Where do we find our grace for humility? Where do we get this wisdom? It's not in ourselves. Our hope is built on Jesus. The first Sunday of every month, we, the believers here at Hope Wesleyan Church, gather to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And one of the things that we are proclaiming is that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, not only did He take on the form of humanity, but He also took on the worst evil this world and the evil prince of this world could dish upon us. He took the worst evil, and through His death on the cross in our place, He turned that into the greatest good. And so as we gather this morning around the Lord's table, as we distribute these elements of the Lord's Supper, we proclaim that we serve a God who is good. Yes, this world is hard, but God is good.